The gavel strikes, echoing through the silent courtroom. Officer James Barrett stares in disbelief as the judge pronounces life imprisonment without parole. For drawing his weapon on General Gabrielle Washington at the funeral impossible, the black general smiles slightly, knowing this verdict hides a truth nobody suspects. Before we dive into this shocking story of racial injustice and hidden conspiracy, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button if you believe justice should be served regardless of badge or uniform, and subscribe to follow more untold stories of courage against systemic racism. Now let's rewind to see how a solemn military funeral became the flashpoint for one of the most explosive racial confrontations in American history. General Gabrielle Washington stood stoically at the edge of Oakwood Military Cemetery in Charleston, her 4 stars gleaming in the morning sunlight, as a gentle breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and lilies placed on nearby graves. At 54, she had broken numerous barriers as the first black female 4-star general in U.S. military history. Her chest adorned with decorations from 3 combat tours and countless successful operations. Today, however, no amount of military preparation could shield her from the weight of grief and responsibility pressing down on her shoulders as she watched the honor guard prepare for Sergeant Marcus Reynolds' funeral procession. Reynolds had died under mysterious circumstances during a training exercise under her command just 2 weeks prior, and although the initial investigation had cleared Washington of any wrongdoing, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed one of her own. The cemetery buzzed with unusual activity for a military funeral, with local police supplementing the standard military security due to the high-profile nature of the ceremony and several senior Pentagon officials in attendance. Officer James Barrett, a 39-year-old veteran of the Charleston Police Department with 13 years on the force, adjusted his uniform as he surveyed the growing crowd from his position near the ceremony site. Unknown to most of his colleagues, Barrett carried a personnel file marked by 7 civilian complaints of racial profiling and excessive force against black suspects, all of which had been quietly buried by department higher-ups who considered him otherwise reliable. The truth behind Barrett's simmering resentment toward black authority figures ran deeper than workplace prejudice. His younger brother Michael had died during a deployment in Afghanistan under the command of a black officer 5 years earlier, a loss that had twisted into a poisonous conviction that his brother had been needlessly sacrificed. As the ceremony began and Reynolds' flag-draped coffin arrived on the caisson, Washington maintained her professional composure while observing the sea of grief-stricken faces, particularly Reynolds' mother, a small woman whose shoulders seemed to bear the impossible weight of burying her only son. When the chaplain concluded the service and the rifle salute faded into sorrowful silence, Washington approached Mrs. Reynolds, feeling compelled to offer personal condolences despite protocol suggesting she maintain distance. Barrett, stationed 20 yards away, noticed Washington's movement toward the family and made a split-second judgment colored by years of unchallenged bias. Before any of his fellow officers could react, Barrett drew his service weapon and shouted across the cemetery, "Freeze! Don't move another step." The command cracked like thunder across the previously solemn gathering, causing mourners to gasp and scatter as Barrett advanced with his gun trained directly at Washington's chest. Dozens of smartphones instantly rose to capture the unfolding scene as Washington remained perfectly still, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced gunfire in 3 war zones. As she stated, "Officer, I am General Gabrielle Washington, United States Army. Lower your weapon immediately." Barrett hesitated momentarily, his finger trembling near the trigger, but kept his gun aimed squarely at her as he responded, "Don't care who you are, you match a suspect description. Keep your hands where I can see them." Several fellow officers rushed toward Barrett, recognizing the dangerous escalation unfolding, with Officer Thomas Rodriguez's body cam capturing Barrett, muttering "uppity bitch" under his breath as his colleagues attempted to defuse the problem situation. The previously solemn funeral disintegrated into chaos, with military personnel moving protectively toward Washington, while Reynolds' mother collapsed into the arms of nearby family members, the final moments of her son's memorial. Desecrated by the ugly spectacle, Washington's aide Lieutenant Michael Chen, a 32-year-old West Point graduate with 2 tours in Iraq, instinctively moved to shield his commanding officer, only to be violently shoved aside by Barrett, causing Chen to stumble backward and strike his head against the corner of a marble gravestone with a sickening crack. Washington broke protocol by rushing to her fallen aide, checking his bleeding head wound, while simultaneously demanding Barrett's badge number and immediate supervisor contact information, her voice carrying both military command and barely controlled fury. Barrett finally holstered his weapon after the intervention of his sergeant, but continued to maintain an aggressive posture, threatening to arrest Washington for interference with police duties if she didn't step back from what he now attempted to classify as an active police situation. The tension between the police contingent and military personnel escalated rapidly, with several uniformed service members moving protectively toward Washington. While local officers formed an uncertain perimeter around Barrett, many clearly uncomfortable with his actions, but bound by the unwritten code of police solidarity. Through it all, the Reynolds family watched in stunned horror as their loved one's final honors dissolved into a stark display of the very racial injustice Sergeant Reynolds had enlisted to help overcome his sacrifice, now overshadowed by an ugly reminder of how little had changed. Within hours of the cemetery confrontation, smartphone videos capturing Officer Barrett's actions flooded every social media platform, accumulating millions of views and igniting fierce debate across the digital landscape as hashtags like #RespectTheStars and #BadgeBias began trending nationally. Traditional media outlets scrambled to frame competing narratives with cable news networks, selecting carefully edited clips that supported their predetermined editorial perspectives. Conservative outlets emphasized Barrett's statement about following security protocols at a high-risk event, while liberal networks highlighted slow-motion footage of his gun aimed directly at a decorated military leader paired with his documented history of civilian complaints. Washington adhered strictly to military protocol by declining immediate media interviews, instead issuing a brief statement through Department of Defense channels that acknowledged the unfortunate incident while expressing confidence in appropriate investigative procedures. Barrett found immediate protection from his police union, which released a strongly worded statement defending his actions as standard procedure for threat assessment in an uncertain environment where the officer had received credible Barrett concerns about potential disruption, though they conspicuously avoided addressing the racial elements capturing public attention. The Charleston Police Department acted swiftly, but cautiously, placing Barrett on paid administrative leave, pending a full investigation, with Police Chief Gregory Williamson reading a carefully worded statement that promised transparency while avoiding any suggestion of departmental culpability. Washington's military colleagues rallied around her with unprecedented solidarity, with dozens of current and retired generals, including several white officers from traditionally conservative backgrounds, issuing personal statements, condemning Barrett's actions and recounting Washington's exemplary 30-year service record that included the successful rescue of American hostages in Somalia and critical diplomatic negotiations in Southeast Asia. Lieutenant Chen's condition proved more serious than initially assessed, with emergency room physicians diagnosing a severe concussion requiring overnight hospitalization and continued monitoring, adding potential aggravated assault charges to the growing list of Barrett's possible legal exposure. National civil rights leaders, including the Reverend Calvin Thompson of the Southern Justice Coalition, arrived in Charleston within 24 hours, holding a press conference on the courthouse steps, where Thompson declared, "When a press conference. 4-star general cannot receive respect at a military funeral because of the color of her skin. We must confront the reality that no Black American is truly safe from armed bigotry, regardless of their service or sacrifice." The Reynolds family released a heart-wrenching statement through their pastor, expressing profound disappointment that our son's ultimate sacrifice for his country has been overshadowed by the very injustice he enlisted to help it overcome their grief, now compounded by the desecration of what should have been a solemn tribute to their child's service. Barrett found himself simultaneously the recipient of death threats requiring police protection and the subject of fundraising campaigns, supporting his defense of proper police procedure with several far-right websites portraying him as a victim of woke military politics, despite the growing evidence against him. Barrett's wife Rachel, an elementary school teacher, with 15 years of dedicated service educating predominantly low-income students, faced immediate harassment at her workplace, with angry parents demanding her removal, anonymous callers threatening the school administration if she remained employed. The Barrett's 17-year-old daughter Madison discovered handwritten notes in her school locker alternating between threatening her family and praising her father's actions, causing her to leave school midday in tears after a panic attack in the cafeteria when several students played the viral video of her father at maximum volume nearby. Department of Defense officials contacted Washington, directly expressing concerns about the incident's impact on military-civilian relations and offering additional security for her and her family as the controversy continued to escalate beyond anyone's control. Mayor Elaine Forrester called an emergency closed-door meeting with police leadership, community representatives, and city attorneys, emerging ashen-faced, to announce that an independent review board would supplement the internal investigation, though she carefully avoided using terms like racial profiling or excessive force that might prejudice potential legal proceedings. Reynolds' mother, Judith, previously reluctant to speak publicly, gave a tearful interview to the local newspaper saying, "My Marcus wore that uniform, believing it would help make a world where people are judged by their character, not their color. Seeing what happened at his funeral makes me wonder if he died for nothing, if anything has really changed at all." Washington arranged a private meeting with the Reynolds family at their home, arriving without entourage or media notification to spend 3 hours sharing stories of their son's service and promising that neither his memory nor the Rennery daughter injustice displayed at his funeral would be forgotten as long as she had any influence within the military establishment. Barrett's personnel file became the subject of intensive focus when department IT specialists reported unusual access attempts and discovered that certain complaint records had become mysteriously inaccessible in the system, prompting the mayor to order physical backup files from off-site storage to ensure evidence preservation. The FBI Civil Rights Division announced they were opening a preliminary review to determine if federal charges might be appropriate, sending 2 agents to Charleston to interview witnesses and gather evidence independent of local authorities. A development that substantially raised the stakes for Barrett and the department that had protected him for years. Washington wasted no time securing legal representation, hiring prominent civil rights attorney Benjamin Michaels, whose 30-year career included landmark excessive force settlements against 12 police departments, and whose commanding courtroom presence had earned him the nickname the Velvet Hammer, for his ability to devastate opposition with seemingly gentle questioning. Who else believes Washington made the right move, getting serious legal help instead of trying to handle this through military channels? Comment number 1. If you think hiring Michaels shows she understands the system she's fighting against, or number 2, if you think she should have trusted the process to work without outside pressure. Like this video if you've ever witnessed someone being treated differently because of their race, and subscribe to follow this story to its shocking conclusion. But could anyone have predicted how deep this rabbit hole would go? Barrett secured representation through the police union's contracted firm, with attorney Victoria Palmer taking lead counsel duties, a strategic choice given Palmer's reputation for successfully defending officers in high-profile misconduct cases through her specialized technique of shifting focus from specific incidents to broader questions of procedural challenges and split-second decision-making in potentially dangerous situations. The Charleston Police Department's Internal Affairs Division faced unprecedented external pressure to expedite their investigation, with Chief Williamson receiving calls from the governor's office and congressional representatives demanding transparency and swift action, while simultaneously fielding concerns from the police union about rush to judgment and due process considerations. Despite significant behind-the-scenes maneuvering to assign a more sympathetic investigator, Detective Amara Johnson, one of only 3 black female detectives in the department, secured the lead investigative role through her seniority and impeccable record, immediately establishing a secure evidence room with limited access and independent documentation procedures that raised eyebrows among colleagues accustomed to more collaborative approaches. Johnson's first significant discovery came when reviewing officer bodycam footage and finding that Barrett's camera had been deactivated approximately 3 minutes before the confrontation, in direct violation of department policy requiring continuous recording at public events. Though another officer's camera had captured Barrett's racial slur, clearly enough for audio enhancement to confirm the exact wording. When confronted with the missing footage, Barrett claimed through his attorney that his camera had malfunctioned earlier in the day and that he had submitted a maintenance request, though department records showed no such request, and when pressed about the slur he categorically denied using any inappropriate language, suggesting the audio must have been misattributed or altered. Military intelligence operating through unofficial channels to assist Washington while maintaining plausible deniability provided her legal team with archived screenshots of Barrett's social media accounts, including a previously deactivated profile under the username TruePatriot88 that contained numerous racist memes and comments about keeping command white and the natural order of authority posts Barrett would later claim were either fabricated or taken out of context. Anonymous sources within the police department, frustrated by years of ignored complaints, began contacting Johnson with information about previous incidents involving Barrett and minority citizens, including 3 excessive force complaints that had been classified as resolved through counseling despite significant evidence supporting the civilians' accounts, and 2 separate incidents where dash camera footage had mysteriously corrupted following traffic stops of black motorists who filed complaints. While the police investigation expanded, Washington received the complete autopsy findings for Sergeant Reynolds through military channels, noting several irregularities that hadn't been highlighted in the initial report, including unexplained toxicology results and tissue damage inconsistent with the reported training accident, raising questions about whether there might be connections between Reynolds' death and the funeral confrontation that weren't immediately apparent. Lieutenant Chen's medical evaluation revealed more severe trauma than initially diagnosed, with neurologists documenting symptoms consistent with traumatic brain injury beyond simple concussion, upgrading potential charges against Barrett from simple assault to aggravated assault with serious bodily injury, a felony carrying up to 20 years in South Carolina State Prison. Johnson methodically interviewed all 7 officers who had previously partnered with Barrett, documenting a consistent pattern of escalated responses when dealing with minority subjects, with 2 former partners admitting under condition of anonymity that they had requested transfers specifically because of Barrett's concerning approach to certain neighborhoods and demographics. Police Chief Williamson maintained a careful public posture of supporting thorough investigation and proper procedure, while privately meeting with city attorneys to discuss liability concerns, particularly after learning that 3 of the attorneys, Perdictac and Fours, previously buried complaints against Barrett had involved substantial preliminary settlement offers that had been rejected by complainants under unusual circumstances. Johnson's investigation took an unexpected turn when forensic analysis of Barrett's phone revealed text messages exchanged with redacted numbers discussing Washington's attendance at the funeral before the event, with one message specifically stating, "Target confirmed for Reynolds' service proceed," as discussed messages Barrett would later claim referred to general security protocols rather than specific actions. Victoria Palmer filed emergency motions to block investigators from accessing Barrett's personal devices and communication records, claiming privacy violations and privileged communications, though Judge Thomas Harding denied the WEX 4 requests, citing the seriousness of the allegations and established case law regarding evidence collection from officers involved in on-duty incidents. Mayor Forrester found herself caught between mounting public pressure for decisive action and behind-the-scenes communications from several prominent campaign donors expressing concerns about rushing to judgment and undermining police morale conversations that would later become central to broader conspiracy allegations when leaked to investigative journalists. Washington's methodical approach to building her case took an unexpected personal turn when she discovered through military records that Barrett's brother Michael had actually served under her command during a classified operation in Afghanistan 5 years earlier, establishing a potential motive beyond general racial animus and raising questions about whether the cemetery confrontation had been a random incident or something more deliberately targeted. Washington's previously pristine military record became the subject of relentless scrutiny as Barrett's supporters, including several fringe military blogs and right-wing media outlets, combed through decades of service, looking for any hint of misconduct or preferential treatment, questioning everything from her rapid advancement through the ranks to her tactical decisions during complex overseas operations, particularly focusing on casualties that occurred under her command. Washington's daughter Zora, a 26-year-old second-year surgical resident at Charleston Memorial Hospital, arrived for her shift to find death threats printed on hospital letterhead placed in her locker, forcing hospital administration to implement security escorts and camera monitoring of all staff areas, measures that created tension with colleagues who resented the disruption despite understanding the necessity. The Washington family home, a lovingly restored colonial in a historically black neighborhood that Marcus Washington, a tenured history professor specializing in civil rights movements, had specifically chosen to support property values in. The community was vandalized overnight, with lurid red spray paint declaring race traitor and Blue Lives Matter across the front porch, and meticulously maintained rose garden, requiring police response from the same department employing the man who had threatened the general. Barrett's family withdrew from public view after receiving similarly threatening communications, relocating to an undisclosed location under protection from sympathetic officers, though their 17-year-old daughter, Madison, made headlines by creating a social media account specifically to disavow her father's actions, writing, "I cannot remain silent while my father's behavior reinforces the systemic racism I've been taught to recognize, and oppose even when it exists within my own family." A post that garnered both viral support and vicious backlash, accusing her of betrayal. Lieutenant Chen struggled through painful physical therapy sessions while battling persistent dizziness, memory lapses, and anxiety attacks triggered by sudden movements in his peripheral vision, his promising military career now uncertain as medical specialists documented post-concussion syndrome with elements of PTSD directly attributable to the violent confrontation, all while military lawyers built a separate civil case against Barrett and the department. Mrs. Reynolds, still deep in mourning for her son, contacted Washington directly after finding disturbing text messages on a phone Sergeant Reynolds had sent home before his death. Messages mentioning that he had discovered something wrong with the inventory and was going to report it up the chain tomorrow, dated just 36 hours before his fatal training accident. Washington's military aide, Captain Samantha Torres, accessed secured records showing that Reynolds had been conducting an internal audit of missing equipment in the weeks before his death, specifically focused on several crates of specialized communications gear and tactical weapons that had been logged as deployed but couldn't be located within authorized operations. Information that seemed unrelated to the funeral incident until patterns began emerging. Detective Johnson's investigation took a dramatic turn when she uncovered Barrett's connection to a group called Patriot Shield, ostensibly a police support organization that internal FBI watch lists identified as a white supremacist group specifically focused on infiltrating law enforcement and military structures, with membership materials emphasizing the importance of maintaining traditional power structures and resisting demographic replacement in tanks, authority positions. The revelation of Barrett's extremist connections sent shockwaves through his precinct, with 5 officers immediately requesting transfers to avoid association, including his former partner of 3 years, who provided Johnson with documentation of concerning comments Barrett had made about the changing face of America and taking back control in the months leading up to the funeral incident. Palmer constructed an elaborate defense strategy centered on portraying Barrett as suffering from undiagnosed PTSD following his brother's death in Afghanistan, claiming his actions at the funeral represented a trauma response rather than racial animus, bringing in a psychiatric expert to provide preliminary evaluation despite Barrett having never sought mental health treatment during his 13 years on the force. Michaels methodically built Washington's case around broader patterns of systemic racism, collecting testimony from 17 minority citizens who had encountered Barrett during his tenure, documenting a consistent pattern of escalated responses, disrespectful language, and disproportionate force compared to his interactions with white citizens in similar circumstances. Chief Williamson faced mounting calls for resignation from community organizations and city council members as Johnson's investigation revealed departmental negligence in addressing previous complaints with internal emails showing Williamson had personally intervened to prevent disciplinary action against Barrett on 2 separate occasions, despite recommendation from direct supervisors. FBI agents monitoring extremist communications identified messages between Barrett and 3 other Charleston officers discussing plans to make a statement at Reynolds' funeral, with one message specifically mentioning making sure the general understands her place communications that transformed the investigation from an isolated incident to a coordinated conspiracy with multiple participants. Washington received an unmarked package containing heavily redacted but still classified documents regarding Operation Shadowhawk, the mission in which Barrett's brother had died, papers that appeared to have been stolen from secure military archives and that included details about the operation never released to Barrett's family or the public, raising serious questions about security breaches and information leaks. The files contained the shocking revelation that, contrary to what Barrett apparently believed, his brother hadn't died due to Washington's tactical error, but had actually been killed by friendly fire during a chaotic extraction, truth that had been classified to protect both the mission parameters and the career of the white male officer responsible for the fatal shot, suggesting Barrett had been manipulated with false information about his brother's death. Mayor Forrester's political future imploded when investigative journalists published documentation of over $300,000 in campaign contributions from the police union and associated support organizations, including $50,000, deposited the day after she personally intervened to prevent an independent review of civilian complaints against the department 3 years earlier. Barrett's increasingly isolated position suffered another blow when his wife Rachel filed for emergency divorce proceedings and sole custody of their daughter after discovering journals in their garage detailing his involvement with extremist organizations and specific plans to provoke confrontation with Washington, evidence she immediately turned over to investigators despite threats from Barrett's supporters. Washington faced her own professional challenge when the Secretary of Defense informed her that a special military review board would be convening to examine her handling of Operation Shadowhawk in light of new information, a transparent attempt by certain Pentagon officials to undermine her credibility during the Barrett investigation by reopening the classified case in which Barrett's brother had died. Department of Defense intelligence officers approached Washington privately with concerns that the funeral incident might connect to broader security issues, revealing that 3 other high-ranking black military officers had reported unusual surveillance and threatening encounters in the previous month, suggesting a coordinated campaign rather than isolated incidents. District Attorney Vanessa Rodriguez, a career prosecutor with a reputation for methodical case-building and unflappable courtroom presence, stood before a forest of microphones on the courthouse steps to announce the charges against Officer James Barrett: assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, criminal threatening, and conspiracy against rights. Each charge meticulously documented in the 56-page indictment that also named 3 fellow officers as co-conspirators in planning what Rodriguez characterized as a deliberate attempt to humiliate and endanger a decorated military leader based primarily on racial animus. Barrett entered the courtroom for arraignment surrounded by a phalanx of union-provided attorneys, pleading not guilty to all charges, while maintaining rigid eye contact with the judge. His attorney, Victoria Palmer, immediately moving to dismiss the case based on what she termed rush to judgment, driven by political pressure rather than substantive evidence. An argument Judge Terrence Marshall swiftly rejected as he set bail at $1 million despite Palmer's objections that the amount was punitive. An anonymous source within military intelligence leaked documents to select media outlets, suggesting that Washington had been under internal investigation regarding discrepancies in operational funding for certain classified missions. Information that Barrett's defense team immediately amplified despite Pentagon officials issuing categorical denials and evidence that the documents had been fabricated, their metadata revealing creation dates after the funeral incident. Palmer constructed an elaborate alternative narrative during preliminary hearings, claiming Barrett had received credible intelligence about a potential security threat to the funeral, and that Washington's movements had matched threat assessment protocols taught to officers, triggering a legitimate security response that had been misinterpreted through a racial lens, despite having solid procedural foundation. National media descended on Charleston in unprecedented numbers when Barrett's connections to the Patriot Shield extremist group were exposed through FBI documentation entered into evidence revealing his attendance at 6.23. Closed-door meetings where speakers had advocated for resistance against minority advancement in traditional power structures and distributed materials about maintaining racial hierarchy in authority positions. The Operation Shadowhawk files, now properly declassified through official channels, revealed the devastating truth that Barrett had built his hatred on a foundation of lies. His brother Michael had actually died, heroically, saving Washington's life during an ambush taking fire intended for her before she personally carried him to the evacuation point and stayed with him until his final moments. Actions that earned her one of her many combat decorations, but had been classified to protect operational details. Washington realized with growing horror that Barrett had somehow accessed falsified information about his brother's death, information that painted her as responsible rather than as the commanding officer who had done everything possible to save him. A narrative Barrett had nurtured into justification for his hatred, despite it being completely contrary to the actual events that had transpired in the mountains of Afghanistan. Detective Johnson uncovered systematic evidence tampering within the department regarding Barrett's previous complaints, including deletion of witness statements, alteration of timestamps on body cam footage, and backdated performance. Reviews created after complaints were filed, all pointing to an organized effort to protect him despite clear pattern of misconduct spanning nearly a decade. Lieutenant Chen, still suffering from cognitive difficulties, but determined to assist the prosecution, experienced a breakthrough during cognitive therapy when he clearly remembered hearing Barrett whisper, "This is for Michael," seconds before. Drawing his weapon at the funeral, a statement captured faintly on enhanced audio from another officer's body cam, and providing clear evidence of premeditated targeting rather than spontaneous security response. Military investigators examining Sergeant Reynolds' death connected the missing weapons he had been tracking to a storage facility rented under a false name, but paid for with a credit card belonging to one of Barrett's known associates in the extremist network, establishing a direct link between Reynolds' death and the conspiracy that had targeted Washington at the funeral. Washington's military review concluded with full exoneration and commendation after a thorough examination of Operation Shadowhawk records confirmed she had followed all protocols and had personally saved 4 soldiers despite sustaining injuries herself with the review board, adding a formal reprimand to those who had authorized the reopening of the investigation without substantive cause. Madison Barrett, increasingly estranged from both parents, but determined to see justice done, contacted Washington through her attorney, offering testimony about conversations she had overheard in the weeks leading up to the funeral, including bias, her father stating that the general needs to be reminded of her place and coordinating with other officers about positions and timing at the cemetery. Michael's investigation into defense attorney Victoria Palmer uncovered disturbing connections between her legal practice and the network of extremist organizations, including her representation of 6 other officers previously charged with racially motivated misconduct and her appearance as featured speaker at a police defense fundraiser where attendees included known members of white nationalist groups documented by the Southern Poverty Law Center. FBI counterterrorism analysts identified communications between Barrett's extremist cell and similar groups in 5 other states, all focusing on strategies to target black military leadership through harassment, intimidation, and staged confrontations designed to provoke reactions that could be used to justify escalation, suggesting a coordinated national campaign rather than isolated incidents. Barrett, recognizing the mounting evidence against him, attempted to secure a plea agreement for reduced charges, offering to provide information about higher-level involvement in exchange for a 20-year sentence with possibility of parole. An offer Rodriguez firmly rejected as insufficient given the severity of the conspiracy and Barrett's central role in its execution. The final autopsy report on Sergeant Reynolds, completed by an independent medical examiner at Washington's request, revealed microscopic evidence of polonium poisoning, a method typically associated with state-level assassination, rather than domestic crime, completely contradicting the initial finding of accidental death during training and suggesting a level of sophistication and resources far beyond a rogue police officer and his immediate associates. Barrett's complete phone records obtained through federal warrant despite ongoing legal challenges from his defense team showed regular communication with an encrypted number later traced to a specialized intelligence contractor with ties to both domestic extremist groups and foreign intelligence services known to be hostile to American interests, raising critical questions about who had provided Barrett with classified information and why. Washington gradually pieced together a disturbing realization. She hadn't been the only potential target at the funeral, as intelligence reports showed 3 other senior black military officers had been scheduled to attend before. Last-minute assignment changes, suggesting the potential for a much larger incident had circumstances unfolded differently. Rodriguez received death threats, warning her to drop or reduce charges, including a particularly disturbing package containing photographs of her children at school with rifle crosshairs superimposed over their images, necessitating round-the-clock protection for her family and raising the stakes of the prosecution to deeply personal levels. Chief Williamson announced his retirement for health reasons, as evidence mounted regarding his role in suppressing previous complaints against Barrett. Though his hasty departure to a recently purchased property in Costa Rica suggested concerns beyond medical issues, particularly after financial investigators identified suspicious deposits to offshore accounts tied to police union consultants. Washington connected the final dots between Reynolds' investigation of missing equipment and Barrett's extremist group when ballistics testing confirmed that the weapon Barrett had pointed at her was actually a specialized military issue sidearm. From the missing inventory, Reynolds had been tracking a weapon that should never have been in civilian hands, and that directly tied Barrett to both the weapons theft and potentially to Reynolds's precking murder. The trial date was set for what media outlets had already dubbed the case of the century, with Judge Terrence Marshall, a conservative jurist with 27 years on the bench and a distinguished military service record before mighting, entering law assigned to preside despite defense motions for reassignment based on his previous statements about the importance of military honor and respect for chain of command. What do you think about a former military officer serving as judge in this case? Comment number 1, if you believe his military background gives him valuable perspective, or number 2, if you think it creates bias toward Washington. Like this video if you're shocked by the conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of power, and subscribe to follow the stunning conclusion of this case. But could anyone have predicted the shocking twist about to be revealed? Barrett's three co-conspirators, Officers Nathan Hughes, Robert Sullivan, and Christopher Drake, accepted plea agreements in exchange for testimony against Barrett, each receiving 15-year sentences, while agreeing to provide complete details of the planning sessions, communication chains, and broader network connections that had culminated in the funeral confrontation. Victoria Palmer constructed Barrett's defense around two primary pillars: his alleged PTSD, resulting from misinformation about his brother's death, and the existence of what she characterized as legitimate security intelligence regarding potential threats to the funeral. Both arguments designed to shift focus from racial motivation to procedural justification, despite mounting evidence contradicting both claims. Michaels meticulously assembled the prosecution's case, creating a timeline that incorporated Barrett's documented history of racial bias, his connection to extremist organizations, his brother's service under Washington, the Ravensquote else, falsified information he had received about his brother's death, his communications with co-conspirators, and the forensic evidence connecting him to both the funeral confrontation and potentially to Reynolds' murder. National media transformed the courthouse steps into a perpetual press encampment, with networks constructing temporary studios in nearby buildings and commentators from across the political spectrum offering continuous analysis of every pretrial motion and evidentiary ruling, while demonstrations supporting both prosecution and defense grew increasingly large and occasionally confrontational, despite heightened security throughout the downtown area. Military intelligence working in coordination with FBI counterterrorism units confirmed through recovered documents and informant testimony that the weapons stolen from military inventory, the same weapons Sergeant Reynolds had been tracking before his death, had been intended for a coordinated domestic terrorist attack, targeting multiple military installations with significant minority leadership. An operation apparently accelerated after Reynolds began asking questions about the missing equipment. Washington discovered her name on a handwritten priority target list recovered during the raid of an extremist compound in rural Tennessee, a document that included photographs, home addresses, and family information for 15 Powson, high-ranking black military officers, suggesting surveillance and planning far beyond what Barrett and his immediate associates could have accomplished without significant outside support. Detective Johnson found herself increasingly isolated within the department as her thorough investigation implicated additional officers and supervisors receiving anonymous threats in her locker and discovering her case files had been accessed without authorization on 3 separate occasions, ultimately requiring her to work from a secured FBI facility rather than police headquarters to maintain evidence integrity. Madison Barrett entered protective custody after an attempt on her life disguised as a traffic accident, the investigating officers discovering that the vehicle that had attempted to force her off a mountain road had been reported stolen, from the same neighborhood where 2 of Barrett's closest associates lived, though direct connections couldn't be immediately established. Washington methodically connected evidence points between Reynolds' death and the conspiracy targeting her, establishing through military forensics that the polonium used to poison the sergeant matched samples previously seized from a domestic terrorist cell, with connections to the same extremist network Barrett had joined, suggesting coordination between multiple groups rather than isolated actors. Barrett's apparent confidence crumbled visibly when he attempted suicide in detention guards, finding him unconscious after ingesting hoarded medication, a note in his cell claiming he was just following orders, and that they'll never let me testify about who really gave the orders, statements that expanded the investigation's focus toward identifying the leadership above Barrett's immediate circle. FBI counterintelligence identified communication patterns suggesting a high-ranking military officer was involved in coordinating aspects of the conspiracy, focusing attention on Brigadier General Lawrence Harrington, Washington's former mentor, who had recently been passed over for promotion in favor of another female officer, though initial evidence remained circumstantial rather than conclusive. Washington realized with growing horror that Reynolds' funeral had been specifically selected as the confrontation site weeks in advance, with evidence suggesting the conspirators had actually influenced the funeral arrangements to ensure maximum publicity and impact, using the solemn occasion as theater for their planned confrontation, rather than responding to Washington's coincidental presence. Lieutenant Chen, working through his ongoing recovery, accessed secured military communications through his cybersecurity connections, discovering encrypted messages proving Reynolds had been deliberately silenced after reporting the missing daughter's 90 weapons up the chain of command messages originating from within the Pentagon's own secure servers rather than from Barrett's extremist cell. Mayor Forrester's political career imploded completely when investigative journalists published documentation connecting her largest campaign donors to shell companies owned by defense contractors with ties to extremist organizations, companies that had received millions in municipal contracts during her administration, despite submitting higher bids than competitors. Victoria Palmer abruptly withdrew from Barrett's defense team after receiving graphic threats against her teenage sons, including surveillance photos taken inside their private school and transcripts of their supposedly private phone. Conversations suggesting that the conspiracy's reach included sophisticated surveillance capabilities typically associated with government agencies rather than civilian groups. Barrett's replacement counsel, Martin Graves, immediately filed motions for competency evaluation and trial delay, arguing that his client's suicide attempt demonstrated mental instability and inability to assist in his defense. Though prosecutors countered with prison recordings showing Barrett displaying clear strategic thinking and detailed recall in conversations before and after the attempt. District Attorney Rodriguez added conspiracy to commit murder charges against Barrett based on new evidence connecting him directly to Reynolds' poisoning, including laboratory analysis matching soil samples from Barrett's boots to the remote training area where Reynolds had been found, and specialized toxicology screening, identifying traces of polonium handling on personal items seized from Barrett's residence during the initial investigation. Washington testified before a closed congressional committee regarding extremism in military and law enforcement, presenting documentation of 47 incidents involving active duty personnel with known extremist connections and highlighting systematic failures to address ideological radicalization within institutions specifically entrusted with public safety and national security. Forensic analysis of the weapon Barrett had pointed at Washington at the funeral confirmed it was not his department-issued sidearm, but a specialized military handgun from the batch of weapons Sergeant Reynolds had been tracking before his death. Its serial number connecting it directly to a shipment that had been diverted from legitimate military inventory through falsified transfer orders signed by someone with high-level authorization. Detective Johnson uncovered documentation that Barrett had received specialized tactical training at a private facility known for contracting with intelligence agencies, training far beyond standard police qualification and typically restricted to special operations personnel, with attendance records showing Barrett had been enrolled by a sponsor whose name had been redacted from all documentation despite repeated subpoenas. Reynolds' personal effects, which his mother had reported as missing from items returned after his death, arrived anonymously at Washington's office, including a personal tablet containing encrypted photographs of weapons, crates, and converted shipping manifests, along with a coded message that, once decrypted by military intelligence, provided locations of 5 additional storage facilities containing diverted military equipment intended for domestic terrorist applications. The courthouse perimeter resembled a military installation on the trial's opening day, with concrete barriers, metal detectors, tactical teams positioned on surrounding rooftops, and a restricted flight zone overhead, as hundreds of demonstrators gathered in designated areas, representing both support for Barrett's prosecution and belief in his innocence, their chants creating a discordant soundtrack to the most anticipated trial in recent memory. Prosecutor Michaels approached the jury box with measured confidence during opening statements, methodically outlining the events at the funeral before expanding his narrative to encompass a conspiracy born of racial hatred nurtured by solemn, institutional protection, and ultimately aimed at undermining the very constitutional principles Officer Barrett swore to uphold. Promising evidence would prove beyond reasonable doubt that Barrett's actions represented the culmination of a premeditated plan rather than a security response. Defense attorney Martin Graves countered with an emotional appeal portraying Barrett as a dedicated officer manipulated by others, fed false information about his brother's death, and suffering from untreated trauma, claiming Barrett believed he was responding to legitimate security concerns rather than acting from racial animus, while simultaneously distancing his client from the extremist connections that had dominated pretrial coverage. The prosecution's first witnesses established the funeral scene through military personnel, cemetery staff, and mourners who had observed Barrett's behavior before and during the confrontation with Reynolds' mother, providing particularly powerful testimony about how the confrontation had destroyed her final opportunity to honor her son's sacrifice. Barrett maintained an unexpectedly confident demeanor throughout the proceedings, frequently whispering to his attorney and taking extensive notes, occasionally making eye contact with Washington in what several jurors later described as unsettling attempts to intimidate the general even within the controlled courtroom environment. Michaels presented the enhanced body cam evidence showing Barrett's approach weapon drawn his whispered comment about, "This is for Michael," and the racial slur captured on Officer Rodriguez's equipment, with audio experts confirming the enhancement process followed forensic standards and that the voice pattern matched Barrett's documented speech patterns from previous recordings. Defense challenges to video authentication faltered when 3 separate technical experts confirmed the footage, timestamps matched dispatch records, and that no evidence of tampering could be detected in the metadata or continuity markers embedded in the department's recording system. Washington took the stand with military precision, her testimony delivered with the same calm authority she had displayed at the funeral, describing the confrontation chronologically before expanding into the investigation that had followed. Connecting Barrett's actions to the broader conspiracy and to Sergeant Reynolds' murder through the recovered weapon and financial evidence, linking Barrett to the stolen military equipment. Cross-examination attempted to portray Washington as seeking revenge for Barrett's brother's death, despite Washington's unassailable service record, a strategy that backfired dramatically when Washington calmly produced the actual mission report showing she had risked her life attempting to save Michael Barrett while under enemy fire documentation the defense had not anticipated being declassified. Lieutenant Chen testified about his traumatic brain injury and ongoing cognitive challenges his military career effectively ended by Barrett's assault, while clearly recounting Barrett's whispered statement about Michael's seconds, before drawing his weapon testimony supported by the enhanced audio evidence and directly contradicting the defense claim of spontaneous security response. Forensic experts confirmed Barrett's weapon at the funeral was actually stolen military property rather than his service weapon loaded with military-grade ammunition not issued to police officers with ballistics tests matching it. To one of the weapons crates Sergeant Reynolds had been tracking before his death, directly connecting Barrett to both the larger conspiracy and potentially to Reynolds' murder. The prosecution methodically established Barrett's extremist connections through digital evidence, including encrypted messages, membership records, and testimony from a former Patriot Shield member turned federal informant who detailed the organization's strategic infiltration of law enforcement and specific discussions about targeting high-ranking black military officers to maintain traditional power structures. Madison Barrett provided devastating testimony against her father, describing conversations where he had specifically mentioned Washington weeks before the funeral, stating that the general needs to be reminded of her place, and coordinating with other officers about positions and timing at the cemetery, directly contradicting the defense claim of spontaneous security response. The defense introduced testimony from a military psychologist claiming Barrett suffered from paranoid delusions exacerbated by misinformation about his brother's death, though this strategy collapsed under cross-examination when the prosecution produced Barrett's complete military separation records, showing he had passed psychological evaluation without concerns and had never sought mental health treatment during his 13 years on the force, despite department-provided resources. Rodriguez presented the scientific evidence connecting Barrett to Reynolds' murder through specialized toxicology screening, identifying polonium traces on personal items from Barrett's residence and soil samples matching the place. Remote training area, where Reynolds had been found with chemical experts, testifying that the sophisticated poison suggested resources and connections far beyond a typical police officer. Judge Marshall faced recusal demands from the defense after journalists uncovered distant family connections to Barrett's extended family. Though Marshall denied the motion after disclosing he had never met Barrett personally and had too. No financial or personal interest in the case outcome, a decision upheld by the appellate court despite defense objections. The prosecution's most dramatic witness came when Colonel Thomas Richardson, a military intelligence officer, granted immunity from prosecution, testified about the broader conspiracy to infiltrate law enforcement and military structures, with extremist members confirming that Washington had been targeted specifically because of her high profile as a successful black female officer, and that the funeral had been selected for maximum publicity impact. Barrett abruptly fired Attorney Graves midway through the defense presentation, announcing he would represent himself despite Judge Marshall's strong advisement against this strategy, a move analysts interpreted as either desperate, overconfidence, or possibly an attempt to create grounds for later appeal based on inadequate representation. The final prosecution witness revealed documentation that Barrett had received payment of $50,000 through an offshore account the day before the funeral from an unidentified source money that remained unexplained by the regenerate defense, and that directly contradicted the portrayal of Barrett as a manipulated pawn rather than active compensated participant in the conspiracy. Barrett took the stand in his own defense, his demeanor surprisingly composed as he methodically presented himself as a dedicated officer with 16 commendations who had received credible intelligence from reliable departmental sources about potential disruption at the high-profile funeral, claiming his response represented standard protocol rather than racial targeting. Under his self-directed direct examination, Barrett portrayed himself as a patriotic American who had followed his brother into public service after Michael's military death, characterizing his actions at the funeral as protective of the ceremony and attendees rather than threatening toward Washington specifically, despite the substantial evidence contradicting this narrative. Cross-examination by Michaels systematically dismantled Barrett's carefully constructed timeline, highlighting 5 critical inconsistencies between his testimony and documented evidence, particularly regarding his communications with co-conspirators before the funeral and his brother's actual circumstances of death, exchanges that grew increasingly tense as Barrett's composed facade gradually deteriorated under precise questioning. Barrett maintained he had never known Washington personally, despite prosecutors producing military photographs showing him attending his brother's memorial service, where Washington had spoken personally with family members, and call records documenting a 3-minute conversation between Barrett and Washington 2 days after his brother's death, directly contradicting his sworn testimony. Defense witnesses included several fellow officers testifying to Barrett's professional conduct and procedural adherence, though cross-examination revealed none had worked directly with Barrett during encounters with minority citizens, and 2 admitted under oath that they had heard him make racially charged comments during private conversations, but had not reported these statements to supervisors. A retired military contractor with documented ties to extremist organizations testified that Barrett had received specialized tactical training through his company's police preparedness program, initially presenting this as standard professional development until cross-examination revealed the program's content focused specifically on urban population control and managing demographic challenges in traditional communities. Euphemisms for racial profiling identified in previous civil rights investigations. Barrett's ex-wife Rachel provided devastating testimony about his increasing radicalization after his brother's death, describing how his initially understandable grief had transformed into obsession with racial hierarchy and specific fixation on Washington, whom he blamed despite evidence to the contrary, including his statement 3 weeks before the funeral that someone needs to remind these people about natural order. The defense psychological expert diagnosed Barrett with delusional disorder, exacerbated by grief and misinformation about his brother's death, though this testimony collapsed under cross-examination when the prosecution presented Barrett's journal entries showing clear logical planning of the funeral confrontation, with specific reference to creating a public spectacle that would remind people what happens when natural order is violated. Prosecutor Rodriguez systematically dismantled the defense narrative during rebuttal, presenting comprehensive evidence of Barrett's methodical planning, recruitment of accomplices, coordination with extremist networks, and specific targeting of Washington based on her race and authority position rather than any legitimate security concern. Culminating in playing the enhanced audio of Barrett's "This is for Michael's" statement that directly connected his personal vendetta to his official actions. Evidence from Barrett's prison communications obtained through legal monitoring protocols revealed continued connections to the extremist network despite his incarceration, including coded messages about maintaining the mission and protecting the structure, directly contradicting his courtroom portrayal as a manipulated victim rather than committed ideologue. Closing arguments presented starkly competing narratives, the defense portraying Barrett as a dedicated officer, manipulated by others, and suffering from psychological trauma, versus the prosecution's methodical presentation of Barrett as a calculating extremist who had deliberately used his police authority to advance a racially motivated agenda while participating in a broader conspiracy against black military leadership. The jury began deliberations amid unprecedented security measures, including sequestration in an undisclosed location, personal protection details, and electronic countermeasures to prevent communication tampering, precautions that underscored the case's significance and the potential for outside interference with the judicial process. After 72 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to a hushed courtroom, delivering a unanimous guilty verdict on all counts: assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, criminal threatening, conspiracy against rights, attempted murder, and conspiracy to commit murder in connection with Sergeant Reynolds' death, confirming the prosecution's narrative of Barrett's central role in both the funeral confrontation and the broader extremist conspiracy. Barrett displayed no visible emotion as the verdict was read, maintaining the same rigid posture he had held throughout the trial. His only response, a barely perceptible nod to someone in the gallery that cameras failed to identify amid the crowded courtroom. Judge Marshall delivered a scathing assessment of Barrett's actions during sentencing, stating that abuse of authority for the purpose of racial intimidation represents the most fundamental betrayal of the oath to protect and serve. Before sentencing Barrett to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available under the combined state and federal charges. In a brief post-verdict statement that sent shockwaves through the courtroom, Barrett looked directly at the cameras and stated cryptically, "It doesn't end with me. The structure remains intact," a statement federal authorities immediately began analyzing for potential connections to ongoing extremist operations and possible coded communications to network members. Washington experienced complex emotions as the verdict was delivered, the professional satisfaction of justice being served tempered by profound concern about the broader conspiracy that Barrett's case had only begun to expose, particularly the unidentified structure he had referenced, that presumably continued operating despite his conviction. National media hailed the verdict as a landmark case against extremism in law enforcement, though coverage divided along predictable political lines, with conservative outlets emphasizing concerns about rush to judgment, while progressive commentators focused on the systematic failures that had protected Barrett despite years of documented misconduct. Detective Johnson received an official commendation for her investigative work, but declined a promotion within the department, instead accepting a position with a newly formed FBI task force focused on identifying and countering extremist infiltration of law enforcement agencies, citing her first-hand experience with institutional resistance to addressing such threats. The FBI announced ongoing investigation into the broader conspiracy Barrett had referenced, including focused attention on potential military and government connections that had facilitated the weapons theft, extremist recruitment, and targeted operations against minority officers that extended far beyond Barrett's immediate circle. Reynolds' family expressed bittersweet satisfaction with the verdict, and Barrett's life sentence justice for their son, tempered by the reality that his military accomplishments and ultimate sacrifice remained overshadowed by the circumstances of his death and the subsequent funeral confrontation, though Washington's continued advocacy helped ensure his service received appropriate recognition. Washington returned to her military duties with the additional assignment of developing new protocols for identifying and addressing ideological extremism within military ranks. Her personal experience providing unique insight into vulnerabilities that had previously been overlooked or deliberately minimized by traditional security frameworks. Barrett entered the federal maximum security system under special monitoring protocols, his communications, visitors, and activities subject to heightened scrutiny based on concerns that he might continue directing or inspiring extremist operations from within prison, particularly given his cryptic courtroom statement about the structure remaining intact. 6 months after Barrett's sentencing, General Washington found herself in an unexpected position, leading a specialized joint task force combining military counterintelligence, FBI, domestic terrorism experts, and civilian oversight. Representatives, their mission focused on identifying and neutralizing extremist infiltration of military and law enforcement organizations. Her personal experience providing credibility with both institutions, despite initial resistance to external scrutiny of internal cultures. What do you think about the true mastermind of this conspiracy finally being revealed? Was justice truly served in this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this story shocking, please like, subscribe, and share this video to help others understand the reality of systemic racism in our institutions. Thank you for watching this incredible journey to justice, and remember that change begins when brave individuals stand against injustice, no matter the personal cost. Barrett maintained an unusually confident demeanor, despite multiple appeals being summarily rejected his prison communications, showing none of the depression or anxiety typical of inmates facing lifetime incarceration behavior that prompted specialized monitoring of his limited external contacts, and raised questions about whether he anticipated some form of intervention or vindication, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. Washington's investigation took an unexpected turn when she received an encrypted message through military channels leading to documentation of offshore financial accounts, connecting the conspiracy to funding sources far more sophisticated than extremist group donations, including transfers totaling over $12 million from shell corporations, later identified as fronts for defense contractors with classified government contracts. Detective Johnson, now working with the FBI Domestic Terrorism Unit, meticulously tracked financial connections between Barrett's extremist network and several high-level government officials, including 2 senior Pentagon administrators and a federal judge, individuals whose positions provided both protection for the conspiracy and access to classified information later used to target Washington and other minority officers. Lieutenant Chen, whose cognitive function had improved sufficiently to return to limited duty, discovered through specialized data analysis that Barrett's brother Michael hadn't actually died in combat as officially reported, but had been executed after discovering unauthorized weapons transfers within the supply chain. He managed his death disguised as combat casualty to prevent scrutiny of the operation he had unwittingly exposed. Reynolds' posthumous investigation gained significant traction when his encrypted files led federal agents to storage facilities in 5 states containing military equipment valued at over $40 million, resulting in the arrest of 12 military contractors and 3 active-duty supply officers connected to the unauthorized transfers Sergeant Reynolds had been tracking before his murder. Washington gradually realized Barrett represented merely a peripheral player in a far more sophisticated operation, his racial attitudes and personal vendetta against her, making him the perfect pawn to create public spectacle while more significant aspects of the conspiracy continued operating behind carefully constructed institutional barriers. Madison Barrett, attempting to reconcile her father's actions with her own moral principles, provided Washington with recordings she had secretly made of family conversations, including discussions between her father and visitors who had break-in, emphasized the importance of maintaining deniability and compartmentalizing knowledge to protect the broader operation if individual actors were compromised. The recordings revealed the shocking truth that Barrett had actually been blackmailed into targeting Washington after discovering portions of the weapons trafficking operation through his police work, his existing racial attitudes, and family connection to Washington, making him the ideal candidate for what his handlers described as a necessary distraction from their primary operations. Washington confronted the devastating revelation that the conspiracy's true mastermind was General Lawrence Harrington, her former mentor and superior officer, who had personally recommended her for advancement throughout her career, while simultaneously building an elaborate shadow operation using military resources for private gain. Harrington, when finally confronted by Washington in a carefully monitored Pentagon meeting, displayed the same calculating arrogance that had protected his operations for years, admitting to orchestrating the weapons theft and Reynolds's murder to protect contracts worth billions of dollars, adding with disturbing candor that the military runs on money, not merit, and that Washington's advancement represented an unacceptable disruption to established power. Networks. Barrett had been selected specifically because of his documented racial attitudes and family connection to Washington, making him the perfect scapegoat whose actions could be attributed entirely to personal prejudice rather than reflecting the systematic corruption that had actually orchestrated the confrontation for purposes of distraction and resource protection. FBI agents arrested Harrington and 7 other high-ranking conspirators across military and government positions, the coordinated raids capturing substantial evidence, including financial records, communication logs, and operational plans for additional actions against minority officers who had been identified as potential threats to the conspiracy's continued operations. Barrett negotiated a limited cooperation agreement, exchanging comprehensive testimony about the conspiracy's structure for transfer to a medium-security facility, his detailed account confirming Washington's suspicions that the funeral confrontation had been orchestrated specifically to create racial controversy that would obscure the financial crimes and weapons trafficking at the heart of the actual conspiracy. Washington visited Barrett in prison, a surreal meeting where 2 people whose lives had been dramatically altered by the same conspiracy recognized how they had both been manipulated by institutional corruption. Barrett, through exploitation of his racial attitudes and family grief. Washington, through systematic undermining of her authority and credibility despite her exemplary service record. Sergeant Reynolds received posthumous recognition, including the Medal of Honor for his courage in documenting the weapons transfers that ultimately cost him his life. His mother accepting the award at a White House ceremony where Washington delivered a personal tribute to the young soldier whose commitment to integrity had initiated the investigation that ultimately exposed corruption at the highest levels of military leadership. Washington established the Reynolds Whistleblower Foundation using her military retirement benefits, creating a secure channel for service members to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, the organization quickly becoming an essential resource for addressing systemic issues previously hidden behind institutional loyalty and chain-of-command pressures. Judge Marshall faced federal investigation regarding his potential knowledge of the broader conspiracy, particularly his connections to defense contractors implicated in the weapons trafficking operation. His previously sterling reputation, now questioned as investigators discovered irregular financial transactions coinciding with key rulings affecting corporate interests connected to the conspiracy. Detective Johnson assumed leadership of a newly established oversight division monitoring extremist infiltration of law enforcement agencies. Nationwide, her first-hand experience with institutional resistance to accountability, making her particularly effective at identifying subtle indicators of organizational protection for problematic officers and policies. Washington provided extensive testimony before congressional committees examining the intersection of racial bias, financial corruption, and institutional protection mechanisms that had allowed the conspiracy to operate undetected for nearly a decade despite multiple investigations that had approached its periphery without penetrating its core operations. Barrett's sentence was reduced from life without parole to 25 years, with possibility of parole in exchange for his comprehensive cooperation against higher-value targets, his testimony proving instrumental in 25 years. Securing convictions against 3 generals, 2 federal judges, and 7 defense contractor executives, who had directed and financed the operation from positions of apparent respectability. The full scope of the conspiracy revealed plans for multiple assassinations of black military leaders who had been identified as potential threats to the weapons trafficking operation, with Washington's name at the top of a priority target list that included 5 other officers who had unknowingly approached aspects of the criminal enterprise through routine duties and oversight responsibilities. Washington realized with grim irony that the incident at the funeral had inadvertently prevented a much larger attack, the public scrutiny following Barrett's actions forcing the conspirators to abandon plans for more permanent elimination of perceived threats, while simultaneously exposing vulnerabilities in their operational security that ultimately led to their identification and prosecution. The nation began a painful but necessary reckoning with institutionalized racism and corruption that had enabled the conspiracy, recognizing that Barrett's obvious prejudice had served as convenient cover for more sophisticated forms of systemic discrimination, operating through financial incentives, professional advancement barriers, and selective enforcement of accountability standards across military and law enforcement structures. Washington, though personally vindicated and professionally elevated by her role in exposing the conspiracy, recognized that addressing the deeply embedded systems that had protected corruption and bias for generations would require sustained commitment beyond any single case or conviction. The struggle against systemic injustice, representing not a temporary assignment, but a fundamental reorientation of institutional values and individual responsibilities within the structures of American power. This story reveals how racism can be weaponized as both a tool and a shield by corrupt power structures. Barrett's obvious prejudice served as the perfect distraction from the sophisticated conspiracy operating behind the scenes. When institutions fail to address overt racism, they create fertile ground for deeper corruption to flourish undetected. The case demonstrates how systems meant to protect society can be compromised when accountability mechanisms are weakened by bias, cronyism, and financial influence. True justice requires looking beyond individual actors to examine the systems that enable them. Washington's victory wasn't just convicting one racist officer, but exposing the entire network that exploited racial divisions for profit and power. Reynolds' sacrifice reminds us that whistleblowers often pay the ultimate price while fighting corruption from within. The story warns us against accepting simple narratives when complex truths lie beneath. What appeared to be an isolated incident of racial bias was actually part of an elaborate conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power. Most importantly, it teaches us that confronting racism requires addressing not just individual prejudice, but also the institutional structures that protect and weaponize it for their own purposes. Change demands both personal courage and systemic reform working in tandem. What systems in your community might be hiding corruption behind more visible problems? Have you ever witnessed someone being scapegoated while bigger issues went unaddressed? Comment below with your thoughts on how we can better support whistleblowers like Sergeant Reynolds who risk everything to expose wrongdoing. If this story of justice delayed but not denied resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find this important message. Subscribe to our channel for more exposés that go beyond headlines to reveal the complex truths behind systemic injustice. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how racism can be manipulated by those in power. Thank you for joining us in this difficult but necessary conversation about accountability in our institutions. Remember, true change begins when we refuse to accept simple explanations for complex problems and demand transparency at every level of authority.